That cat needs to be taken off this plane before we push back. I am not flying with an animal near me. The woman's voice cut through the pre-departure hum of the cabin like a struck bell. 3 rows ahead of me, a young woman in a simple gray sweater sat quietly with a soft-sided pet carrier tucked beneath the seat in front of her, one hand resting protectively on top of it, where a small orange tabby cat blinked out through the mesh window, utterly unbothered by the commotion. "Ma'am, the cat is properly stowed and has an approved pet fee on file," the flight attendant said, calm as ever. "There's nothing irregular here. I don't care what fee was paid. I have a right to a comfortable flight, and that thing is a hazard. I want it removed, or I want a refund and a different flight." I glanced at the young woman with the cat. She hadn't said a single word yet, just sat there, quiet and composed, watching the whole scene unfold with an expression I couldn't quite place. Something between patience and, oddly, amusement. I had absolutely no idea, at that point, just how much that expression made sense. Hey, welcome back to the channel. If you're new here, I fly a lot, and if there's one thing that never fails to surprise me, it's how confidently some people will demand things they have zero authority to demand, especially when it comes to something as small and harmless as another passenger's approved, paid-for pet. Today's story is about a woman I'm calling HOA Karen, because, right on brand, she mentioned her homeowners association within the first 15 minutes, apparently under the impression that her experience enforcing lawn height violations somehow qualified her to dictate airline pet policy at 30,000 feet. This story has a missing cat toy, a tampered carrier zipper, a very calm woman in a gray sweater who turns out to be a lot more important than anyone realized, a public meltdown for the ages, and an ending so satisfying I still bring it up at dinner parties months later. If you love airport chaos and karma stories, you're exactly where you need to be. Stick around, and if you enjoy this one, go ahead and subscribe, because there's a lot more where this came from. Let me back up, because I want you to understand exactly how ordinary this flight felt right up until the moment it wasn't. I was heading out for a short vacation, nothing fancy, just a long weekend somewhere warm to shake off a stretch of gray winter weather. I'd booked early enough to snag a decent seat, packed light, and arrived at the airport with plenty of buffer time, which, if you fly often, you know is basically the golden rule of stress-free travel. I grabbed a coffee, found a seat near my gate, and settled into that pleasant, low-stakes headspace you get into when a trip is simple and everything's already sorted. Boarding went smoothly. I noticed the young woman with the cat carrier fairly early, mostly because she'd boarded during the first boarding group, moving with the easy confidence of someone who traveled often and knew exactly how to get herself and her carry-on settled without holding up the line behind her. She tucked the carrier neatly under the seat in front of her, murmured something soft and reassuring to the cat inside, and settled in with a book of her own, completely unbothered by the general chaos of a full-flight boarding around her. Nothing about her stood out as unusual, beyond the fact that she seemed remarkably calm for someone flying with a pet. Most people I've seen traveling with animals are at least a little tense about it, checking on them constantly, apologizing to nearby passengers preemptively. She just seemed settled. Like she'd done this exact thing 100 times before and had absolutely nothing to worry about. I had no idea, at the time, exactly how true that turned out to be. I settled into my own seat a few rows back, stowed my bag, and did the usual pre-flight ritual, double-checking my phone was in airplane mode, adjusting the air vent, glancing at the safety card out of habit even though I could probably recite it from memory at this point. Around me, the cabin filled steadily with the familiar mix of travelers you see on any given flight, a couple of business travelers already typing away on laptops before we'd even pushed back, a family wrangling 2 young kids into their seats with the practiced efficiency of people who'd clearly done this many times before, an elderly man carefully tucking a paperback into his seatback pocket for later. Nothing about that stretch of boarding suggested anything unusual was coming. If anything, it felt like one of the smoother boarding processes I'd experienced in a while, no gate delays, no overhead bin standoffs, no last-minute gate changes to scramble for. I remember settling in with a genuine sense of relief, looking forward to a quiet, uneventful flight before my long weekend properly began. She boarded about halfway through the process, moving down the aisle with the brisk, put upon energy of someone who considered the entire boarding procedure a personal inconvenience designed specifically to test her patience. Let's call her Marlene. Mid-50s, an expensive-looking travel scarf draped just so, a carry-on she rolled like it owed her money, and an expression that suggested she'd already decided this flight was going to disappoint her before she'd even found her seat. She stopped at row 12, checked her boarding pass against the overhead number twice, and settled into 12B, the middle seat, directly behind the young woman with the cat carrier. Almost immediately, she leaned forward, peering over the seat back. "Is that an animal?" she asked, loud enough for several rows to hear. "Yes," the young woman said simply, not looking up from her book. "A cat. She's approved and fully stowed." "I have severe allergies," Marlene announced, though notably, she hadn't sneezed, coughed, or shown any physical sign of distress at any point since boarding. "I need this addressed immediately." The young woman finally looked up, unbothered. "I'm sorry to hear that. She's in a sealed carrier and won't be coming out during the flight." "That's not good enough," Marlene said, already reaching for the call button above her seat. "I want a flight attendant. Now." The flight attendant arrived within a minute, professional and calm, and listened patiently as Marlene laid out her demands. The cat needed to be removed from the aircraft entirely, or, failing that, she needed to be reseated in a completely different section of the plane with a full refund for her inconvenience. "Ma'am, the cat is properly documented, the fee has been paid, and she's secured in an approved carrier," the flight attendant explained. "Unfortunately, we can't remove another passenger's approved pet from the flight." "This is unacceptable," Marlene said, her voice climbing to the specific pitch reserved for people who believe volume can substitute for being right. "I have rights as a paying customer, and those rights include not being forced to sit near an animal that could trigger a serious medical reaction." "I understand your concern," the flight attendant said. "I'd be happy to see if there's another seat available further from this row, if that would help." "I shouldn't have to move," Marlene snapped. "SHE should have to move. Or better yet, the animal should be removed entirely. I run my community's homeowners association, and I can tell you right now, if someone brought an unauthorized pet into a shared space back home, there would be consequences." The young woman with the cat, still remarkably composed, simply said, "She's authorized. I have the documentation right here if you'd like to see it," and reached into the outer pocket of her bag. Marlene didn't even glance at the offered paperwork. "I don't need to see anything. I need this handled." She sat back with a huff, arms crossed, glaring at the back of the young woman's seat like sheer force of will might somehow make the cat disappear. A few passengers nearby exchanged the particular look strangers give each other when they've all silently reached the same conclusion about someone at exactly the same moment, that quiet, resigned "oh, this is going to be a whole thing" expression I'd come to recognize well from flights just like this one. The young woman, for her part, didn't seem remotely rattled. She tucked her documentation back into her bag, glanced down to check on her cat one more time, and returned to her book with the same easy composure she'd had since boarding, as if difficult passengers were simply an occupational hazard she'd long since stopped letting bother her. For a while after that, the cabin settled into an uneasy quiet, Marlene fuming silently in her middle seat while the young woman returned calmly to her book. The flight attendant had offered, and Marlene had grudgingly accepted, a seat 2 rows back that had opened up, though she made a point of complaining loudly about the inconvenience the entire time she gathered her things. Then, oddly, things started disappearing. The young woman reached down about 20 minutes later to check on her cat and found the small plush toy she'd tucked into the carrier for comfort was missing, not lost inside the carrier, but gone entirely, the zipper compartment where she'd stored it sitting open in a way she was certain she hadn't left it. A few minutes after that, a soft blanket she'd draped loosely over the top of the carrier for warmth had slipped or been pulled off entirely, found crumpled on the floor several feet away, well beyond where normal turbulence or movement could reasonably explain it. And most concerning of all, when she checked the carrier's main zipper closure a little while later, a habit she mentioned to a nearby passenger she did periodically out of caution, she found it partially undone, just enough that the cat could have potentially pushed her way out if she'd leaned against it at the wrong angle. None of it seemed connected at first. But the man sitting across the aisle from her, an older gentleman who'd been quietly reading the entire flight, mentioned that he'd noticed Marlene walking past that row twice during the time in question, each time under the pretense of using the restroom, despite there being a closer lavatory in the opposite direction from her new seat. "That's strange," the young woman said, checking the zipper again with a slight frown. "This was completely secure when I boarded." The flight attendant, informed of the tampered zipper and the missing items, took the concern seriously right away. A compromised pet carrier isn't just an inconvenience, it's a legitimate safety issue for both the animal and everyone seated nearby. She began a quiet, methodical walkthrough of that section of the cabin, asking a few discreet questions of nearby passengers about anything unusual they might have noticed. The older gentleman across the aisle repeated what he'd seen: Marlene's 2 unnecessary trips past that row, and another passenger a few seats back confirmed she'd seen Marlene pause directly beside the carrier during one of those walks, bending down as if to adjust something with her shoe, though her hands had clearly been near the carrier itself. Most commercial aircraft have limited camera coverage in the cabin itself, but the flight attendant made a note of the timeline and the observations, planning to include everything in a formal incident report regardless of what happened next. She also, more immediately, secured the carrier's zipper properly herself, double-checking the closure, and asked the young woman to keep an especially close eye on it for the remainder of the flight. "I really appreciate this," the young woman said, her tone still calm, though there was a new, sharper edge of concern beneath it now, the first real crack in her composure since boarding. "That cat means a lot to me." The flight attendant nodded and continued down the aisle, clearly gathering exactly what she needed to address the situation properly once it came time to confront the person responsible. It didn't take long for the flight attendant to circle back to Marlene's new seat, tablet in hand, having jotted down enough details from nearby passengers to make her next move with confidence. "Ma'am, I've had multiple passengers report seeing you near row 12 twice in the last 20 minutes, around the same time some items went missing from that seat and the pet carrier's zipper was found undone." "I have no idea what you're talking about," Marlene said immediately, crossing her arms. "I used the restroom." "That's not a crime. The restroom closest to your current seat is in the opposite direction," the flight attendant said evenly. "And a passenger reported seeing you bent down near the carrier itself during one of those trips." "That's a complete fabrication," Marlene snapped, though her voice had climbed just slightly, the way voices do when someone's less certain than they're pretending to be. The older gentleman across the aisle spoke up without being prompted. "I saw you both times. You walked past twice, and the second time, you stopped right at that row for a good 10 seconds. A woman a few seats back added, "I saw the same thing. I thought you were just checking your phone or something at first." Marlene's composure, already thin, began visibly fraying. "I don't have to explain my movements on this aircraft to random passengers who clearly have nothing better to do than watch me." "You don't," the flight attendant agreed calmly. "But tampering with another passenger's secured animal carrier is a serious safety concern, and I'll need to document this regardless." By now, the surrounding rows had fully tuned into what was happening, a few phones quietly capturing the moment the way people do when they sense something worth remembering is unfolding. "This is absolutely ridiculous," Marlene announced, loud enough for a good stretch of the cabin to hear. "I am being accused of tampering with an animal cage based on nothing but hearsay from strangers who clearly have some kind of vendetta against me." "Nobody has a vendetta against you," the young woman with the cat said, finally speaking up with a firmness that hadn't been there before. "You've been trying to get her removed from this flight since before we even took off, and now her carrier's been tampered with. Forgive me if I find that connection a little hard to ignore. I want this cat removed from this aircraft immediately," Marlene said again, apparently deciding repetition might somehow succeed where reasoning hadn't. "I run my community's homeowners association, and I know how to escalate situations like this when people refuse to take basic complaints seriously." "Ma'am, we are taking this seriously," the flight attendant said. "Which is exactly why we're documenting the tampering with this passenger's carrier." A ripple of quiet murmur spread through the cabin, several passengers exchanging pointed glances. The young woman with the cat, finally standing to gather her carrier more securely into her lap, looked directly at Marlene with an expression that had shifted from patient amusement into something considerably colder. "You should probably know," she said, calm and clear, "that I'm not just a random passenger you can bully into giving up her seat." Marlene, clearly not registering the shift in tone, barreled forward anyway. "I don't care who you think you are. I want to speak to whoever's in charge of this flight, and I want a formal complaint filed against both of you for how I've been treated today." "I'd be happy to help you file that complaint," the young woman said, an unmistakable edge of dry amusement creeping back into her voice. "Though I should probably mention who you'd technically be filing it against." Marlene blinked. "Excuse me." The young woman reached into her bag, pulled out a slim leather badge holder, and flipped it open just long enough for Marlene, the flight attendant, and several nearby rows to see clearly. It wasn't a badge in the law enforcement sense. It was an executive identification card, the kind issued to senior leadership at the airline itself, her name printed clearly beneath a small company logo. "I'm the founder and majority owner of this airline," she said simply. "So when you say you want to speak to whoever's in charge, that would technically be me." The cabin went, for a solid 3 or 4 seconds, completely and utterly silent. Marlene's face drained of nearly all its color. That's not possible. You're flying in economy." "I like flying with regular passengers," the young woman said with a small shrug. "It's how I actually find out what needs fixing on my own flights. And right now, I'd say tampering with an approved service animals carrier is a pretty good example of exactly that." The flight attendant, to her credit, barely missed a beat, though the slight widening of her eyes made it clear she was just as stunned as the rest of us. She radioed a brief, discreet update to the cockpit, informing them of the incident and the identity of the passenger involved, standard protocol whenever an incident involves executive leadership traveling incognito. Marlene, meanwhile, seemed to be experiencing several emotions at once: panic, embarrassment, and the dawning, horrified realization that every single thing she'd said over the past 40 minutes had been said directly to the person with the most authority possible to act on it. I didn't know," Marlene stammered. "If I'd known, I would never have." "You would never have what?" the airline owner asked, tilting her head slightly. "Demanded a legally approved, properly paid for pet be removed from a flight. Tampered with her carrier when that demand was refused. I'm not sure knowing who I was should change whether any of that was acceptable in the first place." Marlene had no answer for that. None of us did, honestly. It was exactly the right question, asked at exactly the right moment. We landed a short while later, the remainder of the flight passing in a tense, mostly silent stretch, Marlene staring straight ahead, all her earlier bluster completely gone. As soon as the seatbelt sign switched off, 2 airline representatives boarded the aircraft, summoned ahead by that same discreet radio call, and asked Marlene to remain seated while the rest of us deplaned. The last I saw of her, she was being calmly informed that her account with the airline was being flagged for review, given the documented tampering with another passenger's secured animal, and that she should expect formal correspondence regarding her travel privileges going forward. By the time I reached baggage claim, a small cluster of passengers from that flight had naturally gathered near the carousel, still trading disbelieving recaps of what we'd all just witnessed. The older gentleman who'd first noticed Marlene's suspicious trips down the aisle found me specifically to laugh about it, saying it was the best plot twist I've seen in real life in years. The young woman with the cat, once through baggage claim herself, actually stopped to thank several of us who'd spoken up during the confrontation, mentioning that she genuinely appreciated passengers being willing to say something rather than just watching quietly. She scratched the cat gently through the mesh of the carrier and said, half joking, that this particular flight was going to end up as a very memorable case study in an upcoming staff training session. A few of us gave brief statements to the airline representatives before leaving the gate area, confirming the timeline of what we'd witnessed regarding the tampered zipper and Marlene's behavior throughout. It felt like a small thing, but knowing the full account was accurately documented mattered. This wasn't just an entertaining story, it was something that could genuinely affect how the airline handled situations like it going forward. I told this story to friends for weeks afterward, and it never once failed to get the exact same reaction. stunned silence, followed by someone inevitably asking, "Wait, she actually owns the whole airline?" Every single time, I got to say yes, and every single time, it landed just as well as the first. What sticks with me most about this whole experience isn't really the reveal itself, satisfying as it was. It's how completely unnecessary the entire confrontation was in the first place. A properly documented, fully paid-for pet, secured exactly the way airline policy required, sitting quietly under a seat, bothering absolutely no one, and Marlene decided that was worth escalating into demands, sabotage, and ultimately, a very public reckoning with the actual owner of the airline she was flying on. It's a reminder of something I think about a lot after witnessing stories like this. You genuinely never know who you're dealing with, and treating people with basic decency shouldn't depend on whether you think they have the power to hold you accountable for how you behave. The right move was always simply to leave a harmless, properly authorized passenger and her cat alone. That would have been true regardless of who was sitting in that gray sweater in row 11, it just happened, in this case, to matter a whole lot more than Marlene ever expected. So here's my question for you. If you'd been sitting nearby and heard someone demanding a properly authorized pet be removed from a flight, would you have spoken up in the moment the way several passengers did, or just watched quietly and let it play out? Let me know in the comments, and if you've ever unknowingly ended up next to someone way more important than you realized, I'd genuinely love to hear that story too. If you enjoyed this one, make sure you're subscribed, because trust me, Marlene was not the last Karen I've encountered on a flight, and she definitely won't be the last one on this channel. Thanks so much for watching this whole story through to the end. I know these run long, but that reveal really doesn't land the same way without all the build-up around it. If you want more airport chaos and karma stories exactly like this one, this is the channel for it. See you in the next video.